What happens when a corrupt cop lies under oath to destroy a black single mother, but ends up ruining his own career instead? Meet Nina Thompson, a hard-working mother of two just trying to get by. But when Officer Carter falsely accuses her of a crime she didn't commit, her world is turned upside down. He thinks his badge will protect him, but what he doesn't realize? The truth is about to expose him in the most humiliating way. A wrongful arrest, a courtroom showdown, and a shocking verdict that leaves the crooked cop in tears. Stay tuned because this is a battle for justice you won't forget. Before we continue, make sure to like the video and subscribe the channel so the community can grow, and we can bring you more stories like this. Now, let's get into it. The courtroom was silent save for the rhythmic tapping of the judge's gavel as he called the session to order. The air was thick with tension, each breath measured, every glance uncertain. At the defendant's table sat Nina Thompson, a 32-year-old single mother of two, her dark brown eyes weary but defiant. She had been here before, not in this exact courtroom, but in situations like this, where the system seemed designed to work against people like her. Across from her, at the prosecution's table, sat Officer Daniel Carter, his neatly pressed uniform betraying no hint of the storm brewing within. He had been on the force for 15 years, long enough to know how to manipulate a courtroom, long enough to know his badge gave him an unspoken advantage. Today, he intended to use it. 2 weeks earlier, it had started like any other day. Nina had just finished a 12-hour shift at the diner, exhaustion dragging at her every step. With her 2-year-old son, Malik, in her arms and her 7-year-old daughter, Ayana, trailing sleepily behind her, she hurried into the corner store to grab a few essentials before heading home. The encounter had been quick, but devastating. Officer Carter, patrolling the area, had entered the store and immediately fixated on her. The suspicion in his eyes was instant, the accusation already forming before he even spoke. "Ma'am, can I see your bag?" His voice had been firm, authoritative, leaving little room for refusal. Nina's brows furrowed. "Excuse me?" "I said, let me see your bag," he repeated, his hand already hovering near his holster. A heavy silence had settled between them. Other customers had paused, some pretending to mind their business while others openly gawked. "I didn't steal anything," Nina said, her voice controlled, but beneath it, anger simmered. She knew her rights. She knew she had done nothing wrong. Officer Carter smirked, as if her defiance amused him. "Then you won't mind showing me what's inside." Realizing she had no choice, Nina exhaled sharply and opened her bag. Inside were a few diapers, a small carton of milk, and a loaf of bread. Nothing more. But Carter wasn't satisfied. He reached forward, yanking the bag from her hands, causing Malik to whimper and Ayana to clutch her mother's leg in fear. "She has something in her pocket," Carter suddenly announced, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Nina's eyes widened. "What?" "No, I don't." Before she could react, he grabbed her wrist, twisting it behind her back. Pain shot up her arm as she struggled to keep her balance. "Stop resisting!" he barked. "I'm not resisting!" Nina cried, panic lacing her voice. She was terrified, not just for herself, but for her children, who were now crying hysterically. It hadn't mattered. He had shoved her against the counter, ignoring her pleas, ignoring the cries of her children. And when she was finally handcuffed, he had turned to the bystanders and declared, "Caught her shoplifting. Guess she thought she could get away with it." The moment the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked shut, Nina felt a wave of disbelief crash over her. How had this escalated so quickly? How had a simple grocery run turned into this nightmare? Malik screamed in terror, his tiny fists reaching for his mother. Ayana sobbed, clinging to Nina's leg until Officer Carter yanked her away. "Get back," he ordered the little girl. His tone was cold, dismissive, like they weren't even human. "I swear I didn't take anything," Nina pleaded, her voice cracking. "Check the security cameras." But Carter wasn't listening. He turned her toward the store entrance, his grip firm as he guided her out. The humiliation burned hotter than her anger as she noticed the onlookers. Some whispered among themselves, others simply turned away. No one intervened. Outside, the flashing red and blue lights of a patrol car made her stomach lurch. This couldn't be happening, not in front of her kids, not like this. "Officer, please," she tried again, struggling against the panic that threatened to consume her. "My children, just let me—" "Enough," Carter snapped, pushing her toward the vehicle. "You're going downtown." One of the store clerks hesitated at the entrance, looking uncertain. Officer, I was watching the register. I don't think she had something in her pocket," Carter interrupted, his voice authoritative. "I saw it." That was a lie. But before Nina could argue, the door slammed shut behind her, leaving her children crying on the sidewalk as Carter pulled away. 5 hours later. The fluorescent lights in the police station were harsh, their unyielding glare making everything feel sterile and impersonal. Nina sat in the holding cell, her hands clenched into fists. She had spent the last hour demanding to speak with a lawyer, but no one had listened. She wasn't the only one in the cell. Other women sat around her, some slumped against the walls, others staring blankly ahead. But Nina couldn't afford to sit quietly. She needed to get out. She needed to get back to her babies. Footsteps echoed down the hall. A heavy-set officer with tired eyes unlocked the cell. "Thompson, you made bail." "Bail? Who had—" Her answer came as she stepped into the waiting area and saw her best friend, Lisa, arms crossed, her expression a mix of worry and fury. "Nina!" Lisa breathed, rushing forward. "Are you okay? What the hell happened?" Nina swallowed the lump in her throat. "Carter happened." Lisa's jaw tightened. "Come on, let's get you home." 2 weeks later, Nina had filed a formal complaint. She had replayed the events over and over, trying to make sense of them. Now she sat in the courtroom, her fingers gripping the edges of the wooden table. Across from her, Carter smirked, confident as ever. He thought he'd already won, but the judge's next words would change everything. 2 weeks later. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs, the weight of anticipation heavy in the air. Nina sat rigid at the defendant's table, her fingers gripping the edges so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her lawyer, Jordan Matthews, whispered something reassuring, but she barely heard him. Her mind was spinning. Across the room, Officer Carter sat with his arms crossed, his expression smug. He had been through this process before, many times, and it always ended the same way. The officer's word against the accused, and the officer always won. But today felt different. Judge Reynolds, an older man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, adjusted his glasses and turned to Carter. "Officer, please repeat your statement for the court." Carter cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly. "On the night in question, I witnessed Ms. Thompson stealing from the convenience store. I personally saw her place an item in her pocket before attempting to leave without paying. When I confronted her, she resisted, forcing me to detain her on the spot." Lies. Every word was a lie. Nina inhaled sharply, willing herself to stay calm. Matthews, her lawyer, stood. "Your Honor, I'd like to present new evidence." Judge Reynolds nodded. "Proceed." Matthews turned toward the screen positioned at the front of the room. "This is the surveillance footage from the convenience store on the night of the arrest. The owner was kind enough to provide it." Carter stiffened. His jaw clenched as the video began to play. On screen, Nina entered the store with her children, exhaustion evident in her posture. She selected a few items, paid at the register, and walked toward the exit. The video clearly showed her pocket was empty the entire time. Then came the moment Carter approached her. The courtroom watched as Carter stopped Nina, demanded her bag, and, without cause, grabbed her wrist. The footage clearly showed the way he manhandled her, twisting her arm behind her back despite her compliance. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Carter's smirk had vanished. He shifted in his seat, his fingers twitching slightly. Matthews turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, this footage contradicts Officer Carter's sworn testimony. Not only did Ms. Thompson not steal anything, but it's clear she did not resist arrest in any way. This was an unjustified assault and a false arrest. Judge Reynolds exhaled, his expression unreadable. "Officer Carter," he said slowly, "do you have an explanation for this?" Carter swallowed. "Your Honor, the angle, maybe it didn't capture everything. I know what I saw." Matthews didn't let him off the hook. "Or maybe, Officer Carter, you fabricated an entire story to justify your actions." Silence stretched. Then the judge spoke. His next words would shake the entire courtroom. Judge Reynolds adjusted his glasses, his gaze fixed on Officer Carter. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating, as though the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable fallout. "Officer Carter," the judge said, his voice calm but firm, "this footage is damning. It directly contradicts your sworn testimony. Do you understand the severity of perjury?" Carter shifted in his seat, sweat beading on his forehead. His usual confidence was faltering, his smirk long gone. "Your Honor, He cleared his throat, searching for words. "There must be some mistake." "A mistake?" Matthews interjected, his tone razor sharp. "The only mistake here is that you assumed no one would challenge your fabricated story. You lied under oath, Officer Carter. You assaulted an innocent woman in front of her children, then tried to paint yourself as the hero." Gasps rippled through the courtroom again, murmurs growing louder. Even some of Carter's fellow officers, seated in the gallery, exchanged uneasy glances. Judge Reynolds raised a hand, signaling for silence. He turned his attention back to Carter. "I will ask you one last time. Do you have any justification for your actions?" Carter licked his lips, his fingers gripping the table. He was trapped, and he knew it. But he couldn't back down, not without losing everything. "I was just doing my job," he muttered. "I thought I saw something. I was trying to prevent a crime." Matthews scoffed. "Prevent a crime? The only crime committed that night was by you, Officer Carter. You abused your power. You terrorized an innocent family, and now you're scrambling to cover your tracks." Nina sat frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. She had dreamed of this moment, of someone finally standing up for her, of justice being served. But part of her still feared it was too good to be true. Judge Reynolds leaned forward. "Officer Carter, based on the evidence presented, I have no choice but to take this matter seriously. Perjury, false arrest, and excessive use of force are not things I take lightly." Carter paled. "Your Honor, please. The court finds that Officer Carter deliberately falsified his report and provided misleading testimony," the judge continued, ignoring his protests. "A formal inquiry will be launched, and I will be recommending an immediate suspension pending further investigation." Carter's mouth fell open. "Suspension?" His voice cracked, disbelief washing over him. The judge's eyes hardened. "You should consider yourself lucky. If found guilty of perjury, you could face prison time." The murmurs in the courtroom turned into outright whispers. Carter looked around, panic creeping into his eyes. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Meanwhile, Nina exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. A lump formed in her throat, not of fear, but of relief. For the first time in a long time, justice had finally taken her side. Carter's face twisted with desperation as he looked to his fellow officers in the gallery, hoping for some unspoken support. But none came. Some of them avoided his gaze entirely, while others watched with unreadable expressions. The weight of what was happening was settling in. He was on his own. "Your Honor," Carter tried again, his voice less assured, "this is all being blown out of proportion. I made a judgment call based on my experience. If we start questioning every officer's split-second decisions, Judge Reynolds held up a hand, cutting him off. "This is not about second-guessing officers doing their jobs. This is about you abusing your position, lying under oath, and unlawfully detaining a citizen. That is unacceptable." Carter gritted his teeth. His fingers dug into the table so hard his knuckles turned white. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had been untouchable for years, his word always accepted without question. Now, in front of an entire courtroom, he was being exposed for what he truly was. Matthews stood, his expression firm. "Your Honor, in light of this evidence, my client should have never been arrested in the first place. I request that all charges against Ms. Thompson be immediately dismissed and that Officer Carter be held accountable for his misconduct." The judge nodded. "Agreed. Ms. Thompson, you are hereby cleared of all charges. This case should have never been brought against you in the first place." Nina's breath hitched. For 2 weeks she had been carrying the weight of this accusation, her name dragged through the mud. And now, with a single decision, it was over. Her eyes welled with tears, but she blinked them back, determined to hold her composure. "Thank you, Your Honor," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the buzz of the courtroom. The judge then turned his focus back to Carter. "As for you, Officer Carter, I'm ordering an immediate review of your conduct by Internal Affairs. Your suspension is effective immediately, pending further investigation." Carter shot up from his chair. "You can't do this," he barked. "I have served this department for 15 years. You're going to ruin my career over one incident?" Judge Reynolds' eyes were cold. "No, Officer Carter. You ruined your own career." The words hit Carter like a slap. His body sagged slightly as the reality set in. This wasn't a slap on the wrist. This was the beginning of the end for him. Lisa, who had been sitting behind Nina, let out a small, victorious exhale. "That's what you get," she murmured, just loud enough for him to hear. Carter's jaw clenched as he turned to glare at Nina. But for the first time, his intimidation had no effect. She met his stare head-on, unflinching. Justice had finally been served. 10 minutes later. As Nina stepped out of the courtroom, the fresh air felt different. Lighter, freer. She turned to Lisa, her voice steady. "Let's go home." And for the first time in weeks, home felt safe again. 5 days later. The fallout from the courtroom decision spread fast. News stations picked up the story, broadcasting the footage of Nina's wrongful arrest and Officer Carter's perjury. Social media exploded with outrage. Hashtags like #Justice for Nina and #End Police Corruption trended for days. People from all over the country weighed in, some expressing relief that justice had been served, others furious that Carter had only been suspended rather than fired on the spot. At the local police precinct, the tension was palpable. Officers spoke in hushed tones, exchanging glances whenever Carter walked by. Some sympathized with him, believing he had simply made a mistake. Others kept their distance, unwilling to be associated with a disgraced colleague. Carter could feel the shift, the power, the respect, the silent authority he once held. It was all slipping through his fingers. He had spent his career being feared, his word taken as absolute truth. Now people questioned him, and that, more than anything, burned. 2 weeks later. Nina was finally starting to feel normal again. The nightmares had lessened. The panic attacks, though still there, weren't as suffocating. She focused on work, on her kids, on trying to rebuild what had been shattered. But the trauma still lingered. She had spent years knowing the system was against her, but now she had undeniable proof. What if the store hadn't had cameras? What if no one had believed her? How many others had gone through this same ordeal, their voices drowned out by the badge of their oppressor? She was one of the lucky ones, and that thought haunted her. "Mommy?" Ayana's soft voice pulled Nina from her thoughts. She turned, offering her daughter a small smile. "Yeah, baby." "Are we safe now?" Ayana's big brown eyes shimmered with worry. Nina knelt down, brushing a stray curl from her daughter's forehead. "Yes, baby. We're safe." Ayana hesitated. "What about the bad man?" Nina's stomach twisted. "He can't hurt us anymore." But even as she said it, doubt lingered in the back of her mind. 1 month later. Officer Carter sat in front of the review board, his hands clenched in his lap. The investigation had dragged on longer than he'd expected, and with every passing day, his future in law enforcement grew more uncertain. The board members eyed him coldly. Officer Carter, after reviewing the evidence, including the surveillance footage, your false statement, and your history of similar complaints, we have reached a decision. His pulse pounded in his ears. We find that your actions were in clear violation of department policy. Effective immediately, you are terminated from the force. Carter's world crumbled. Furthermore, the lead investigator continued, the district attorney is reviewing your case for potential criminal charges. You may want to speak to a lawyer. For the first time in his life, Carter felt powerless, and for the first time in hers, Nina finally felt free. 2 months later, Nina stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her blazer. The woman staring back at her looked different, stronger, more determined. The past few months had changed her. The fear that once weighed her down had been replaced with purpose. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Lisa peeked in, grinning. You ready? Nina exhaled, nodding. Yeah, let's do this. They walked into the packed community center where dozens of people had gathered. Activists, lawyers, concerned citizens, all there to discuss police reform and racial injustice. Nina had been hesitant at first, but after everything that had happened, she couldn't stay silent. She took the stage, gripping the microphone tightly. A few months ago, I was arrested for a crime I didn't commit, she began, her voice steady. I was humiliated, manhandled, and forced to defend myself against lies simply because a police officer assumed I was guilty, because of the color of my skin. The crowd murmured in agreement, nodding along. But I was one of the lucky ones, Nina continued. I had proof. I had people who fought for me. But what about those who don't? How many innocent lives have been destroyed because they weren't believed? A wave of applause filled the room. This is bigger than me, she said. It's about a broken system that needs to change, and I won't stop fighting until it does. Lisa beamed from the front row, pride shining in her eyes. Nina had found her voice. Meanwhile, Carter sat alone in his small, dingy apartment, staring blankly at the wall. His once pristine uniform hung in the closet, untouched since his firing. The silence was unbearable. He had tried to fight the charges, but the evidence was stacked against him. The district attorney was moving forward with perjury and misconduct charges. His lawyer had warned him. Prison time was a real possibility. His reputation was in ruins. The force that had once shielded him had discarded him like trash. The people who once respected him now avoided him like the plague. His phone buzzed on the table. He ignored it. He already knew what it would be. More reporters, more messages from former colleagues pretending to check in while secretly distancing themselves. He had lost everything, and deep down, though he refused to admit it, he knew he had no one to blame but himself. 6 months later, Nina sat in her newly opened nonprofit office reviewing grant applications. She had turned her pain into something bigger, an organization dedicated to fighting wrongful arrests and providing legal aid to those in need. A news alert popped up on her phone. Former Officer Carter sentenced to 5 years in prison for perjury and misconduct. She stared at the screen for a long moment, then put the phone down. She felt no joy, no satisfaction, just a quiet sense of closure. Justice had been served, and for the first time in a long time, she felt truly at peace. This story proves one powerful truth. No matter how much corruption exists in the system, justice will always find a way. Nina didn't win because she was the loudest. She won because she had the truth on her side. Officer Carter thought his badge made him untouchable, but in the end, his lies caught up with him. Let this be a reminder. Never let fear silence you. Stand firm, seek the truth, and fight for what's right. Because when you do, even the most powerful liars will fall. Make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on post notification to be the first to know when interesting and lesson-packed stories like this one drop.